Hello and welcome to the Berean Voice. I'm Randy Seaver. This is our 8th video in our study of the Epistle of Paul to the Romans. Last time we were talking about Romans 1:18, in which Paul says, because the wrath of God is revealed from heaven. That is, this is why we need this redemptive work of Christ. This is why we need this plan of God for the salvation of believers. And that is because God's wrath, God's settled indignation against all that is the contradiction of His holiness, is engaged against us. That is, it is engaged against those who are lawbreakers, those who have not loved God, those who have not therefore loved their neighbor. And then he says, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. I'd like to just talk to you a little bit about people suppressing the truth. There are many, many ways in which we can suppress the truth in unrighteousness. And basically, what we're doing when we suppress the truth of God is hiding our eyes. Are we blind? Yes. We are blind because we have poked out our own eyes, spiritually speaking. I'm sure if you've been around little children very much, you've noticed them saying something like this with their hands over their eyes, "You can't see me." And in their childlike minds, they're thinking, if they can't see you, you can't see them. And I think that's what's happening when people suppress God's truth in unrighteousness. Because of our unrighteousness, we don't want God to see us. And we think that if we can refuse to see God and pretend that God is not, whether we verbalize that or not, and I don't think in reality there is any such thing as an atheist. I think atheist is just a nice name for a rebel against God who suppresses God's truth, because I don't think even atheists really deny that God is in their heart of hearts. I think they know, according to this text and others, they know not only that God is, but that God is worthy of worship and that God is going to bring them into judgment. They know this. And yet they're trying to suppress it. And the more they suppress it, the duller the message becomes that God is and God deserves to be worshipped. And so the character that Paul gives to the entire race, keep in mind we're talking about the universal need of the gospel, not the need of some really hardened sinners who need the gospel, but we're talking about the need of every sinner, because every sinner is doing the same thing. This is really much like what John says in John chapter 3, when he says, this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, but men loved darkness. Notice he doesn't say some men, some women. He doesn't say judicially hardened men. He says men in a state of nature universally reject the light. This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, but men love the darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. And everyone who practices evil hates the light and will not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. And you say, well, the text goes on to say, but there are those who come to the light, right? And it does, because there are those who come to the light. The question is, why are there those that come to the light? The question isn't, do some do that? The question is, why do some do that? And the answer of John is, they do this that it might be made manifest that their works have been wrought in God. In other words, they're coming to the light to give evidence that God has been at work in their hearts. But you see, the light does not produce faith. The light produces hatred in the hearts of wicked sinners, so that sinners are continuously suppressing the truth wherever we find it. The problem isn't that God hasn't given us sufficient light. If we were not blind and if we did not hate God, then the light that God has given in creation would be enough to cause us to worship Him and thank Him and glorify Him. And we're going to look at those terms and see what Paul means by them a bit later. But if it were not for our willful blindness, our willful suppression of the truth, then there would be sufficient light for us to come to know who God is and to worship him as he deserves to be worshiped. This is general revelation. And I think it's important for us to understand Paul's argument here. Keep in mind that Paul is in a judicial setting. This is what he is setting before us as a courtroom scene. And this is going to be exceedingly important to us when we come to the doctrine of justification, because justification is about a courtroom scene. It's not about a doctor's office. Justification is not about God doing something in you to make you better. Justification is about a judge declaring you either to be guilty or not guilty. And in justification, God acquits us and credits us with the righteousness of Christ. But we're going to get to that later. So it's really important to us that we understand that we're dealing with a judicial setting. And Paul himself and the Holy Spirit are the prosecutors in this case. You are not only the accused, and I'm not only the accused, but we are members of the jury, and Paul is asking us to come up with a verdict of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And can he present the evidence that we are guilty? That's the question before the court. Okay? And that's what Paul's working on here. Okay? First thing he says, you're guilty because you have suppressed the truth of God in unrighteousness. You've put your hands over your eyes and refused to see the clear revelation. And the defense attorney, not the real one, but the one who's sort of the stand-in, because we have a much better defense attorney than anyone, even O.J. Simpson and others have had. We have a defense attorney who's never, ever lost a case. You think Perry Mason was some lawyer? Our attorney is always successful, and that's Jesus Christ. But this guy who's standing in, maybe the offender himself, the accused, says, wait a second. If my client had only had sufficient light, then he would have done what he should have done and would not be found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. He just didn't have revelation. And Paul's argument is, listen to it, let's read it together. Because, why is the accused guilty? Verse 19. Because what may be known of God is manifested to them, for God has shown it to them. Where has God shown it to them? How has God shown it to them? In what way? And the answer of verse 20 is, for since the creation of the world, the invisible attributes of God, that is, the things that might be known about God, have been clearly seen, being understood from the things that are made, that is, the creation, in order that they are without excuse before God. That is, in order that they might be without a legal defense in the presence of God. How are we without a legal defense? Because we knew that God existed, and the evidence that God exists is in his creation. You recall that the psalmist wrote, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night shows knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. This is what is referred to as general revelation. It is revelation that is given to all without exception. There is no place on the earth where this revelation is not given. Has God given this revelation in a greater way in some parts of the earth than he has in others? Absolutely. I live in Costa Rica, one of the most beautiful places on the planet. We have more reason, I think, to be required to glorify God than a person living in the desert, unless perhaps you like living in the desert. One of the problems I have with our friend James White is that he's remained in the desert so long, and we wonder why, but that's aside from the point. When you could live in a place like Costa Rica and see the beauty. Some people have greater revelation than others. Is that God's prerogative to give some greater revelation than others? Absolutely. Absolutely. But do all have some revelation of the glory of God? Is there any place on the face of the earth where that glory is not seen? And the answer of the writer of the psalmist is no. There is no speech, there is no language where their voice is not heard. Or perhaps another rendering of that is no speech, no language. Their voice is not heard, and yet their voice is heard. Their voice is heard because there is a clear revelation of God. And yet people have suppressed the truth of God as it is revealed in the creation of the world. Now, in order for this accusation to hold, the sinner must have ability. I know that sounds strange coming from someone who denies spiritual ability, total depravity. But this is what the text says, and we have to believe what the text says. The text tells us that sinners have the ability of rationality. Sinners are able to reason from cause or from effect back to cause. Sinners are able to reason from design back to designer. Sinners are able to rationally conclude that if there is order, there must be someone or something ordering what is ordered. These arguments are sometimes used to try to prove the existence of God. We don't need to prove the existence of God to sinners. Why not? Because they know already in their heart of hearts that what we believe about God is true. They know, Paul says, that the decree of God, the declaration of God, that those who practice these things are worthy of death, and yet they not only do them, they take pleasure in those that do them. Verse 32 of this chapter. They know. So don't tell me that there are atheists who have rationally come to that conclusion. No. If you use your rational powers, your rational abilities, then you must come to the conclusion that God exists. I don't need to prove that to you, because you know that in your heart of hearts. What have you done with that knowledge is the question. And the answer is, you have concocted ungodly ideas to try to get rid of the idea that God exists. You have suppressed the truth in unrighteousness, because you think that if you can get rid of God, then God can't see you, and he's not going to bring you into judgment. Some people suppress the truth of God by immorality. They think that somehow if I engage in this and in that and in something else, I can sort of blot out, I can drown out this voice that is crying out to me in nature. Believe it or not, some people can suppress the truth of God through false religion. You can suppress the truth of God by walking a church aisle and making a profession of faith and getting baptized. And then you can go through the rest of your life without any commitment to Christ whatsoever, thinking, I have become a Christian. But you're just deceiving yourself if you think that, if indeed there has been no real conversion. You see, there's a big, big difference between making a decision and God converting you by his sovereign grace. Big difference. Listen, the Apostle Paul says if our gospel stands veiled, it stands veiled to those who are lost, in whom the god of this world, Satan, has blinded the minds of those that believe not, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ should shine unto them. But the God who has commanded the light to shine out of darkness has shined into our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. If the light of the knowledge of the glory of God has never dawned in your soul, then you need to know you have never, ever been converted. It's not about some cheap and tawdry decision that you have made. It's about God, the sovereign creator of all things, creating you anew, causing His light to shine into your heart, and giving the knowledge of His glory in the face of Jesus Christ. We're going to see what that means. What do we mean when we talk about the glory of God and glorifying Him and the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ? Well, we're going to get to that, so kind of hang in and we'll talk about it. It's really important as we think about what God does in conversion. But people suppress the truth in unrighteousness by religious experience. They may think, that they're going to earn their salvation by observing the sacraments or by having infused grace so that they are able by their own obedience to ultimately get to the place in sanctification that God can declare them to be righteous. And all that's all a suppression of the truth in unrighteousness. And we could just talk about many examples of that. You need to ask yourself the question, am I suppressing the truth in unrighteousness? Or am I acknowledging that I have the light that God has granted in creation, but I have not reacted properly to that light? We have the ability to reason that if there is design, there must be a designer. That is an ability that we have, and it is because we have suppressed that knowledge that we are guilty before God and under the wrath of God. And the apostle goes on. God has shown it to them, verse 19. For, where has God shown it to them? For since the creation of the world, the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood from the things that are made, even His eternal power and deity. And here we have a construction in the original language that could be taken in two different ways. It could show purpose or it could show result. And in reality, it could be both. Okay? But I think at least it means with the result that, not in order that they should be without excuse, but with the result that they are without a legal defense in the presence of God. Now, why are they without a legal defense in the presence of God? And Paul answers, because. You see what I'm talking about? Walking through the passage, four after four after four after four, because what Paul's doing is he's raising these questions. Okay, we're guilty before God. We're without a legal defense in the presence of God. Why? Why are we without a legal defense in the presence of God? And Paul answers, because. Because, and he uses a participle, I think, concessively here, for although they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful, but became futile in their reasonings, in their dialogues, and their foolish heart was darkened. Now, one of the things I want us to see here is that we always go from bad to worse in sin. We never remain static. We are always going downhill. A friend of mine was preaching on the parable of the Good Samaritan one time, and the parable says a certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and his point was you always go down from Jerusalem to Jericho. You always go down. You always get worse when it comes to sin. We never remain static. It was Jeremy Taylor who said This is the progress of sin in a man. At first it startles him. Then it becomes pleasing. Then easy. Then habitual. Then the man is confirmed in it. Then he is reprobate. And then he is damned. And that's a quotation from memory. You might want to look that up on the internet, but it was something of that nature. Sin doesn't leave you where you are. You can't think, I'm going to just stay right here, static in my sin. No, your sin is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse, and you're going to get harder and harder and harder as you continue in your sin. Ultimately, if you continue in your sin long enough, God is going to say, as he did of Ephraim in Hosea, Ephraim is joined to idols, leave him alone. What fearful words. What fearful words. We can't continue in sin and think that we're going to remain static in sin. It's always downhill. Listen, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for images made like unto men and birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. And for this cause God gave them over. Okay? And so we have this exchange. In fact, we have 3 exchanges in this chapter. And we're going to talk about those a little later on. And what Paul is saying is, don't think you're going to stay where you are. We go from bad to worse. All right? So they did not glorify him as God. They were not thankful, but became empty in there. They became empty in their reasonings. You see, God is giving them over little by little to themselves. First of all, we have rational ability, and we are responsible. We are guilty because we know the truth, and yet we have suppressed the truth. We have the ability to reason. But little by little, we lose that ability to reason, and so we begin to come to bizarre conclusions. And you see, this happens not only to individuals, this happens to societies. And I think we're seeing much of that in our world today. You know, I often say, how stupid can you be? And yet there are so many people that are taking that as a challenge. And I have to stop saying that. But I look at the rationality factor in society, and I think, how could anyone come to that conclusion? And I think the answer to that question is that because we have decided that we are not going to love God or worship God any longer, or allow him to be part of the fabric of our society, God is little by little giving our society over to a reprobate mind, that is, a mind that is incapable of rational thought, especially rational thought about spiritual issues. We'll talk about that more later. But it seems to me that this is what's happening, and it happens to societies as well as individuals. God, little by little, gives us over. I mean, again, how stupid can you be to bow down and worship an idol of your own making, a god of your own making? You have to know, don't you, that if you made that God in your image, or in the image of a bird or a beast or a creeping thing, if you made the image, then the image cannot do anything. They have eyes, says the Old Testament writer. They have eyes, but they don't see. They have ears, but they don't hear. They have hands, but they don't handle anything. And those that make them are like unto them. They're dead in trespasses and sins. And you would have to reason that if I made the idol can't do anything to help me. But you see, that's the process. You see, I'm going to get something from this thing that I'm worshiping. But you made it. You're the idol. You're the idol maker as well as the idolater. And we'll talk about that a bit more. I want to go back, though, and talk in our next session about what it means to glorify God. And in what ways have we not glorified God? How does that factor into this whole mess that we're talking about? The plight of man in sin. And additionally, I want to talk about what happens in conversion. You see, what happens in conversion is that we begin again to glorify God. We begin again to show gratitude. This is why the writer of the Hebrews says, let us have gratitude, so that we might accept God acceptably with godly fear. Let us have gratitude. And then there is this matter of worshiping God. What that means is if we begin to worship God, then we have to displace some idols. We have to toss them out. Okay, you can't worship God and idols at the same time. You can't serve your money and God at the same time. You're either going to love one and hate the other, or whatever. Okay, so we're going to talk about glorifying God. We're going to talk about gratitude toward God. We're going to talk about worshiping God, and what all of that means and why that's important. But here's the point. Paul's saying, even the Gentiles that do not have the inscripturated word as a revelation from God, even the Gentiles are not without a revelation, and the Gentiles, fallen sinners, have the rational ability to understand that if there is design, there must be a designer. If there is order, someone must be ordering it. If there is a purpose, someone must have purposed it, and so forth. Even the rawest pagan is religious because there is a God-shaped hole in the soul of every sinner that only God can fill, and therefore we are incurably religious people. We're going to worship something. Either you're going to worship Him or you're going to find something else to worship. Okay, we'll talk about that next time. Hope this is helpful. If it is, please click like. If you have friends who need to hear biblical exposition, I hope that you'll invite them to join you in watching the videos, and then to tell their friends. I think what we're doing here is worthwhile. I hope you do. And if you do, keep watching. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do that as well. And tell your friends to do so as well. Until next time, may God richly bless you.